He once swore he'd never leave me. But the day he won the lottery, he changed the locks and threw my clothes to the street. Inside, he laughed with a strange woman like I never existed. I stood in the rain, holding the same red umbrella I once used to shelter him. If you think this is just another African family story, you're mistaken. Subscribe now for haunting and unforgettable episodes from African family stories. It all began on a rainy night, under the faded zinc rooftops of Agbogbloshie, where the scent of roasted maize and smog mixed in the early dusk. Nia's fingers moved with the silent rhythm of someone who had spent her whole life stitching torn edges back together. The needle pierced the heavy cloth in her lap again and again. Not just fabric, but a symbol of survival, of patching up what the world tried to rip apart. She sat near the front door of her mother's one-room house. A wooden structure warped by time, and rain crouched low to the ground like it too was tired. It was the end of the day. The hum of life around the market slurred into a dull roar of closing stalls, shouting children, and the occasional burst of laughter that felt foreign to her. Lately, joy was something she overheard rather than experienced. Inside, Mama lay curled on a mat, her chest rising and falling. Shallowly. There were good days and bad ones. Today was neither. It was just another day where Nia counted change in her pocket and wondered which bill she could push back another week. The hospital had called about Mama's tests, but she had let it ring out. No point in answering a question she already knew the answer to. The sky broke with a sound like something had cracked in half. Thunder. Fast, guttural, and too close. Then came the rain, thick and unforgiving, as if the heavens were trying to wash the city away. Nia jumped to her feet, grabbing her fabric bundles, racing to pull them off the drying line before they soaked. She hated the rain. It made the roof leak, brought sewage into the gutters, made the air smell like rot. But mostly, it reminded her that no matter how many stitches she placed, some things still fell apart. As she reached for the last cloth hanging on the line, she saw him half hidden by the metal frame of an abandoned kiosk, slumped low like a broken doll. His hair was matted, shirt torn open at the shoulder, one sandal missing. The downpour battered his back, yet he didn't move. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was surrender. Nia froze, not because she was afraid life had drained that luxury from her years ago, but because in that brief moment, she saw herself in him. Not his body, but the defeat stitched across his posture, the raw exposure of someone who had nothing left to protect. He lifted his head slightly as if sensing her, and through the curtain of rain, their eyes met. His were bloodshot with that lost glass look of a man no longer asking for help, just waiting for the end to stop dragging. Nia cursed under her breath. Damn it. She looked down at her palm, callous, damp, and then at the folded red umbrella by the doorway. A gift from Mama back when she still walked to church on Sundays. Nia hadn't used it in months, afraid the torn edge would give out. But it was still the only thing in the house that could be called beautiful. She grabbed it, opened it, and stepped out into the monsoon. The moment she held the umbrella over his body, the light shifted. The red fabric caught the dull yellow of the street lamp behind them, casting a warm, surreal glow on the broken man beneath. In that pocket of shelter, the rain still roared, but it no longer touched him. For a second, it looked like the world had paused just for them. He tried to speak, but it came out as a cough. Easy, Nia muttered, crouching beside him. His skin was hot despite the cold rain. Fever. Maybe worse. You'll catch death sitting out here. He shook his head weakly. Already caught him, I think. She didn't laugh. It wasn't funny. She looked around, no one else nearby. The market was empty now. Everyone had scurried to shelter, left the night to the desperate and the forgotten. Can you walk? She asked. He nodded barely. She didn't offer her arm. He was too heavy for that, but instead braced her shoulder under his and helped him rise inch by inch. The weight of him against her was shocking. He felt like a sack of soaked bones. Still, she didn't flinch. Nia had carried worse burdens. They hobbled toward her house in silence, the umbrella trembling above them, threatening to collapse at every gust of wind. Inside, she kicked the door open with her heel and guided him onto the wooden floor. Mama stirred but didn't speak. Her eyes opened briefly, just long enough to see the stranger, and then closed again, as if saying, "Just another stray you've brought home, child." Nia dropped her bag, pulled out a faded blanket from under the bench, and draped it over him. "I don't have medicine," she said, mostly to herself. "Just ginger hot water and prayer." The man tried to sit up, but winced, clutching his ribs. "What's your name?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to give her the truth. "Ray." "Ray what?" He smiled faintly. "Just Ray." She narrowed her eyes. "Suit yourself?" Nia went outside again, retrieved the umbrella, and closed it slowly. She stared at the red fabric, now torn, a bit more sagging, useless in the rain, but it had done something. It had changed the course of 2 lives. Inside, Ray had drifted into a half-sleep, breathing in shallow huffs. His fingers twitched as if still playing a song. Nia sat by the bench, eyes darting between her mother and this stranger now lying in the heart of her house. She didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or what his presence would cost her. But something about the night felt different, as though it had cracked something open in her, something beyond duty and survival. There was a silence now, not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that arrives before a story begins. Nia leaned back, closed her eyes briefly, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, maybe to the roof, maybe to the stars she couldn't see, "Don't make me regret this." And with that, the rain continued to fall. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something to be feared. It felt like something cleansing, something new. In a corner, the red umbrella dripped steadily, each drop a ticking clock counting down toward a destiny neither of them could yet name. Under the waning morning light of Ogbog where rusting tin rooftops shimmered like coins long buried in the dirt, the fragile quiet inside Nia's house was broken only by the scrape of a mop dragging across the wooden floor. Ray moved slowly, rhythmically, wiping away the film of mud left by the previous night's storm. His shirt clung damp against his back. His face, still bruised and sunken, held a quiet determination, as if the act of cleaning this space, this sacred corner of Nia's world, might somehow make up for the silence he had carried with him when he arrived. He didn't speak much, but his actions were loud. Nia watched him from the doorway, one hand gripping a basket of thread and scraps. Her mother lay behind her, half asleep on the mat, wrapped in one of Nia's handmade quilts. The house smelled like ginger and lemon balm, steeped so long in boiling water it had thickened the air. Ray rinsed the mop in a cracked blue bucket and set it aside. Then he did something strange. He reached for a broom and began brushing the soot off the walls near the cooking hearth. It was the kind of chore most men wouldn't even notice. Nia raised an eyebrow. "You always clean like your life depends on it." Ray didn't look back. "It kind of does, doesn't it?" She didn't answer, but a sliver of her mouth tilted upward. The first hint of humor between them. They settled into a strange rhythm over the following days. Ray, though clearly unwell, insisted on doing what he could. He fetched water from the rust-colored pump 3 streets down, even when his arms trembled from fever. He swept the floors before sunrise and lit the charcoal stove before Nia returned from the fabric stalls at dusk. He would sit beside Mama, strumming soft melodies on a borrowed colago, a 2-string lute whose sound carried through the thin walls and out into the neighborhood. At night, when the streets emptied and the sounds of the market dulled into distant echoes, his music filled the air with something different, not joy exactly, but longing. Songs without lyrics, mournful, beautiful things that made even Nia pause mid-stitch and just listen. By the 4th day, Ray began humming a tune he hadn't played before, delicate like rain on a tin roof. One night, as the coals burned low and Nia massaged her mother's feet, he whispered through the melody, the title barely audible. Under the red umbrella, Nia's fingers froze. She glanced at him, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were closed. He swayed gently, letting the notes cradle him. Later that evening, Nia sat on the step outside the house elbows, on her knees, the cracked umbrella resting beside her, like a discarded memory. Ray emerged, crouched beside her. You mad I named the song after it? He asked softly. No, a beat. It's just a broken umbrella. No, Ray said. It was a moment. He looked at her, then really looked. Not as a woman who had helped him, not as a poor seamstress in a dying market, but as something bigger. Someone who had cracked open a door in the storm when no one else would. From the alley, a voice pierced the stillness. Nia, you running a hotel now. A high laugh followed. Another voicemail, older, coarser, cut in. Be careful. You bring in strays, they might bite. Nia's jaw tightened. She didn't look up. The voices belonged to Mr. Mensah, the butcher, and his cousin, the metal scrap dealer. They leaned near the edge of their fence, eyes trained on her like vultures scenting weakness. Behind them, a young girl giggled, one of the nosy neighbor daughters, who mimicked everything she saw. Ray stood. I'll go inside. No, Nia said firmly, louder than she meant to. The men paused. Ray glanced at her, unsure. She turned to them. You worried about strays, Mensah? Maybe check your own house first. I hear your wife's been feeding one while you snore. Laughter exploded from a nearby window. One of the women on the second floor had clearly heard it too. Mr. Mensah's face hardened, and he turned away without another word. Ray blinked. You always talk like that. No, only when I'm not tired. A long silence followed. Then she added, which is almost never. The next morning, Nia awoke to the sound of music, not from Ray's fingers, but from his voice. He was singing. Low, soulful, and cracked in places, but it was unmistakable. Words had been born from the melody. The song wasn't just about an umbrella. It was about being seen in a moment you thought you were invisible. It was about the warmth of a stranger's touch in a world that only ever took. It was about a storm that didn't just flood the streets, it stripped you bare. He sang it like a confession. And Nia listened from the shadows of the hallway, hand over her mouth, eyes wide. That night, after Mama drifted to sleep, and Ray returned from the market with a small packet of tomatoes bought with what little money Nia gave him, the two sat outside again, sharing silence. I wrote that for you, he said simply. I know, she replied. Then softer, I just don't know if I can carry any more songs, Ray. He didn't reply. But his gaze dropped and he nodded, as if he understood. Inside, Mama stirred. A few moments later, her voice came worn and thready. Nia. She stood immediately, moving inside. Her mother's eyes were open now, more alert than they had been in days. That boy, Mama said, looking toward the curtain that separated their small living space. Yes, his eyes. They're like your father's when he was young. Kind, but reckless. Nia swallowed. Mama reached for her hand. Kindness is good, my child. But misplaced kindness. That's how the strongest hearts are broken. Nia blinked back, something heavy. He's not like that, Mama. You don't know him yet. And you're tired. Tired girls fall fastest. The words hit harder than she expected. Mama had never been one for poetic warnings, but tonight her tone was different, less motherly, more prophetic. Nia tucked the blanket tighter around her mother. I know where my edges are. Mama squeezed her fingers. Pray they stay unfrayed. Later, Nia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while the sound of Ray strumming drifted through the wall. The words of the song had taken root in her lines, like seeds, promises she didn't ask for, but now had to carry. Under the red umbrella, you saw me before I vanished, before the world claimed the last of me. You held me, like I still mattered. She closed her eyes, the lyrics echoing like a ghost. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew this, whatever this was between them, however fragile or foolish, it had begun. Not with words, not even with music, but with a single red umbrella held out in the rain. The news came on a Wednesday morning, humid, thick-aired, the kind of morning where sweat clung before the sun even fully woke. Nia was stitching the hem of a faded school uniform for one of the neighborhood girls when Ray burst through the curtain. Breathless, a folded paper trembling in his hand. They want me in Lagos, he said. Nia didn't look up immediately. Her needle kept moving calm and steady before she finally paused and glanced at him. Who's they? Ray unfolded the letter and held it out like a trophy. A label. Independent, but real. One of the scouts heard me at the Cross Market 2 nights ago. He sent a voice note to the producer in Lagos. They listened. They want me to come. A live audition. This week. Silence lingered. Then Naya reached out, took the paper. The ink was smudged, the print grainy. But it was real. There was a phone number, a signature, a logo with a treble clef wrapped around the continent of Africa. You sure it's not a scam? He shook his head. I spoke to them. They said I've got something. Raw. Said they're looking for something from here, from the people, not polished, real. She looked back down at the cloth in her lap, and her needle moved again. How much is the trip? Transport, food, a place to stay for 2 nights. Ray exhaled. I'm short. I don't have anything. But I thought maybe. He stopped himself. Nia didn't respond right away. She finished the hem, knotted the thread, then set it aside. Go get me the iron, she said. Ray blinked. What? She stood. Walked to the corner where a small wooden trunk sat beneath a stack of folded fabrics. She knelt, lifted the lid, and pulled something wrapped in a red cloth. The iron was cold. Old-fashioned. Cast iron, no plug, no steam. You had to fill it with hot coals to use it. Ray brought the other one, sleeker, newer, plastic handle chipped on one side. You have 2, he asked. No, Nia said. I had 3. And then she reached deeper and pulled it out. The sewing machine, black and gold with its flower decals faded, but still elegant. Heavy, built to last. It had belonged to her mother. And before that, her grandmother. Ray's eyes widened. Nia. She didn't look at him. Her fingers traced the edge of the metal wheel, the tension knob, the worn spot where her mother's thumb used to rest. I can get 50,000 cedis for it, she said quietly. Maybe 60. That's not enough to get you there and back, she interrupted. Enough to cover a hotel for a night or 2. Food. And maybe a new shirt. Ray crouched beside her. I can't let you. You didn't let me do anything, she said, finally looking at him. I decided. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. I'll pay you back, he said. Every coin. She laughed, a small, dry sound. You think this is about money? He was quiet. Then she added, promise me one thing. Anything. Come back. I will, he said. Rich or poor, famous or forgotten. I'll come back. Nia's gaze didn't waver. You promise? Ray held her hand tighter. I swear. She nodded once, and just like that, it was decided. The next 2 days moved fast. Naya took the sewing machine to an old man who dealt in pawned goods 2 streets down. He eyed her warily. He knew what it was, knew it had history. He offered less than she hoped, more than she feared. She took it. With the money, they bought Ray a bus ticket to Lagos, a second-hand pair of boots, and a crisp white shirt that Nia altered herself. She also packed him a bag of roasted groundnuts, a worn notebook, and a small vial of clove oil. For your throat, she said. He didn't argue. The morning of his departure, she rose before the call to prayer. The city was still blanketed in gray. They walked to the station in silence. She carried the umbrella, now patched with black thread, the handle wrapped in cloth to keep it from slipping. The bus loomed ahead like something mythic. Its flaking paint and dented bumpers couldn't hide the weight it carried. Dreams, hopes, escape. Ray turned to her. This isn't goodbye, he said. Nia didn't smile. Then what is it? A pause. She studied his face, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the scar above his brow, the way his mouth always fought a grin. She didn't know if she'd ever see it again. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. Light, reverent. Then, with hesitation, he stepped back and took the umbrella from her hand. You'll need this, she said. He shook his head. It's yours. And then the wind picked up. A gust caught the edge of the umbrella and yanked it from his fingers. It tumbled into the air, spinning awkwardly, caught in the draft of the departing bus. They both watched as it danced above the crowd before slamming to the ground and skidding under a nearby bench. Neither of them moved to retrieve it. Ray looked back at Nia. I'll come back for it, he said, and his voice was thick now, like he was swallowing something hard. Nia just nodded. The bus roared to life, and within seconds he was gone. The sound of the engine faded, swallowed by the city. Nia stood there for a long time, watching the empty road. The red umbrella lay near the gutter, bent slightly. its metal ribs twisted. She walked over, slowly, picked it up, folded it in silence, and cradled it to her chest like a child. It smelled faintly of dust rain and something else, something not yet broken. She turned toward home, alone again, but not the same. Something had been offered. Something had been promised. And that kind of hope, dangerous as it was, burned quietly in her like a coal waiting for air. Under the slow churn of Guyana's harmattan season, when the sky turned a washed-out yellow and dust moved like breath through the streets, Nia waited. At first, it was a hopeful kind of waiting. The kind where you check your phone, even when it hasn't rung. Where you open the mailbox, even when you know it's Sunday. She'd sit outside on the worn bench by the doorway, fingers still moving with fabric needle in hand, but her eyes fixed on the path leading to the market square, half expecting, half praying that he would appear again. Dusty boots, guitar slung over his shoulder, that crooked smile, that promise I'll come back. Days passed, then a week, then 3. She told herself he was just busy, that he didn't have signal, that Lagos was chaos, that maybe the label sent him traveling. She invented scenarios like thread from her needle-stitching reasons into excuses into illusions. By the 5th week, the dust was thicker. Her mother coughed more at night, and Nia's hope began to wear thin. Then came the news. It didn't arrive like a bomb. No, it crept in like a whisper through the side of her world. A young girl named Essie, who sold oranges 3 stalls down, came by with wide eyes and a radio. "Sister Nia," she said, excitement clinging to her voice. "He's on it, you're Ray." Nia paused mid-stitch. "What?" "On the air. A music video. I heard his name. Ray Zola. He's on TV." Nia stood slowly, heart thudding like a drum. The name was familiar. Ray had once joked that if he ever made it, he'd drop his last name. Said it sounded like a tax collector's name. Zola, he told her once, means peace in Lingala. That's who I want to be. Essie's radio buzzed with static, but the voice came through smooth, polished French accented, and that was Under the Red Umbrella by Zola, the Ghanaian-born sensation, now taking Paris by storm. The artist just signed a major label deal. Rumors say it's 7 figures. The rest blurred. Nia sat back down. The needle dropped to the floor. Her hands were suddenly too still. He had made it. Her Ray, her stray, her songbird. He'd made it to Paris, but she hadn't heard it from him. Not a word. Not a text. Not even a lie. It was Essie who brought the video the next day. A scratchy DVD burned by her cousin, who worked at an internet cafe. They watched it on the neighbor's small television. Ray stood in the center of a set designed to look like a rain-drenched street. The lighting was cinematic. The notes were familiar, too familiar. It was the song, their song, Under the Red Umbrella. But it wasn't just the song. It was who was standing next to him. A woman, tall, light-skinned, wrapped in silk and sequins. One hand on his chest, the other holding a red umbrella over both of them. Her lips brushed his cheek as the camera closed in. "Supermodel Adeline Rue, rumored girlfriend of Zola," the voiceover began. Nia didn't hear the rest. She stood and left the room without a word. She didn't cry that night, not yet. There was something about betrayal that moved slowly in her like ink spreading through water. But the next morning, when she went to the cupboard and saw the empty space where the sewing machine had once been, the one she sold for him, she fell to her knees. And she stayed there until Mama called her name. Her mother's condition worsened. The cough became deeper. Her hands began to tremble. Some mornings, she didn't wake until noon. And when she did, her voice was brittle. "I heard you crying," Mama said one day, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "No, Mama," Nia lied. "You heard the wind." "No, child, it's not the wind that breaks like that." Nia said nothing. She stopped going to the market after that. She sent Essie instead. Stopped answering her phone. Stopped talking to neighbors. Stopped singing when she cooked. The house grew quiet, suffocating. Mama watched it all. "You're not made for silence, Nia," she said. "I'm not made for being forgotten either," Nia answered. Mama didn't reply. In time, Nia scraped together enough money through odd jobs, old savings, and one loan from a reluctant uncle to buy a second-hand machine. Not as beautiful, not as smooth, but it worked. She opened a shop. It was small, a cracked front window, one faded awning. But the name she painted above the door was Bold Nia and Wind, Nia and the Wind. No one understood the name, not really. But Nia did. It was for the thing that always left, always returned, but could never be held. She took in orders slowly. School uniforms, church dresses, a few tailored shirts for a young teacher in town. The work kept her hands busy, if not her heart. Some nights, she'd sit at the machine long after the lights went out, her feet pushing the pedal in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fabric. Just motion. Just staying in motion. The umbrella sat by the door, bent, faded. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away. One evening, as she was closing up, a customer lingered. "You never play music in here," the woman said. "You know most tailors play radio or gospel. It makes the work feel lighter." Nia didn't look up. Not everyone needs noise. The customer chuckled. True, but sometimes silence is just pain with good posture. Nia stopped. Her fingers paused on the needle. That night, she didn't eat, didn't sleep. She sat outside with the umbrella in her lap, the breeze curling around her ankles. She wondered if Ray even remembered her name now. If he thought about the way she held him when he had nothing. If he heard her voice when the crowds cheered his. Then, like a thief, the grief arrived. Sudden, ugly, loud. She cried into the umbrella, into the memory of his promise, into the wound of his absence. Mama woke up to find her curled on the porch. She said nothing. Just placed a hand on Nia's shoulder and stood there, thin as air, strong as ever. Morning came. Nia bathed, tied her scarf, and opened the shop. She stitched. She smiled at customers. She told Essie to stop bringing news. She let the silence settle like dust across her soul. But every time the wind blew the curtain aside, she still looked up. Just in case. The night Mama died, there were no tears. No dramatic gasps. No last words whispered into trembling hands. She simply stopped breathing sometime between dusk and the early breath of midnight, and Nia found her the next morning with one palm open toward the ceiling and a faint smile pressed into the wrinkles around her mouth. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence Nia had grown used to, the one that draped over everything after Ray disappeared. But a deeper, unforgiving stillness. A kind of finality. A door closing that would never open again. Nia didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She sat next to the body for almost an hour, tracing the veins on Mama's hands with her thumb. In the other room, the sewing machine buzzed faintly. She had left it running in her exhaustion the night before. The sound grated against the stillness, like a reminder that life had the audacity to keep going. By noon, she had wrapped Mama's body in the kente cloth they had saved for special occasions and carried her herself to the mission clinic. They offered to help, offered transport ceremony flowers, but Nia declined. "I'll handle it." And she did. 2 days later, Mama was buried in a quiet corner of a shared cemetery beneath a neem tree that swayed as if in mourning. There was no choir, no eulogy. Just the scraping sound of soil being thrown onto a wooden box and the rhythmic hum of Nia's own breath, measured and stubborn. The red umbrella sat at the head of the grave, closed, bent, faded. It was the only marker. When she returned to the house, she didn't step inside right away. She stood outside the door watching as the wind pushed the curtain back and forth. It reminded her of lungs, breathing in, breathing out, mocking her. She went in, pulled the umbrella from Mama's grave before anyone could steal it, and hung it on the wall above her sewing machine. Not because she believed in superstition, because some part of her needed to see it. There needed something on the wall that testified to what she had given, what she had lost. In the weeks that followed, Nia became something else. Something sharper, something hollow. She opened the shop every day at sunrise. She stitched until her hands cramped. She took every order, never refused a client. But the warmth was gone. No tea for customers, no soft jokes, no humming under her breath. She worked like a machine, precise, tireless, unreachable. Children from the neighborhood came knocking one by one. "Auntie Nia, can you teach me how to make a blouse?" "Auntie, I want to sew like you." "Auntie, just show me how to thread the needle." Nia looked at them with eyes that didn't blink enough. "No."
"But,"
I said no. Eventually, they stopped coming. Even Essie, who once brought Nia mango slices wrapped in paper, stayed away. The laughter that once filled the narrow alley behind the shop grew distant, as if the children themselves knew they were now standing at the edge of a place where joy was not allowed to live. Inside, the red umbrella stared down at Nia every time she sat at her machine. It was warped from rain bones showing through where the fabric had torn, but it still held its shape like a witness too proud to die. Nia couldn't bring herself to take it down. She talked to no one unless absolutely necessary. When customers tried to ask how she was, she changed the subject. When they lingered, she clipped her answers short. Her voice, once a soft velvet, now came in cuts and seams. Like everything else she touched, it had become functional, efficient, cold. She never mentioned Ray, not when his face showed up on glossy flyers pasted to broken telephone poles. Not when his voice filled market radios with phrases in French, English, and Pidgin. Not when his silhouette graced billboards in Accra with the tagline, "Zola the storm before the calm." Nia didn't flinch. But every night when the lights went out and the wind picked up outside, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling until morning came. Sometimes she would dream of her mother, not in death, but in motion, sewing, walking, dancing barefoot in their yard as a younger Nia watched, clapping in rhythm. In those dreams, the world was colored brighter. The air was softer. Nothing had been taken yet. Then she'd wake up, and the world would come crashing in, black and white and loud with absence. The umbrella remained on the wall, like a photograph of something too painful to forget and too sacred to erase. One afternoon, months after Mama's funeral, Nia overheard two women talking outside her shop. She didn't mean to listen, but the words came through the window, clear as thunder. "She don't even smile no more. You know she used to laugh so much. People said she was possessed, ever since her mother died. And that boy disappeared. She's just been a ghost." A ghost. Nia didn't disagree. That night she looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were dull, her skin pale. The scarf on her head was tied too tightly, like she was trying to hold herself together through fabric alone. She sat at the sewing machine and turned it on. It buzzed. She fed cloth under the needle and stitched without looking, eyes still fixed on her reflection. The machine made straight, perfect lines. Like her. Straight, perfect, hollow. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I'm not broken." Then she looked up at the umbrella and added, "But I'm not whole either." And the work continued. The orders came and went. The sun rose and set. The wind returned each evening, rustling the curtain like breath against her neck. But nothing changed. Not really. Nia had closed the book, but never healed the wound. And in that silence, she made her home. The first time anyone noticed the man limping through the market, they didn't recognize him. He was thinner than before. Not the lean, chiseled thin of a celebrity, but the sickly, collapsing kind. The kind that lived in the hollow spaces between the ribs that turned wrists into bone and skin. His beard was patchy, overgrown, the beginnings of gray, threading through it like time had taken up residence while no one was looking. His shirt hung off him like it had been borrowed from another body. The only thing that hadn't changed were his eyes, bloodshot, sunken, but unmistakably his. Ray. He had returned, but the city didn't welcome him. The moment his feet touched the cracked pavement of Agbogblashi's main street, whispers followed. Not recognition, at least not at first, but confusion, disbelief. Then a sharp collective intake of breath as one of the teenagers yelled out, "You isn't that Zola?" Someone laughed. "No way. Zola don't walk. He flies in jets." But the man didn't fly now. He limped. One hand pressed against his side, the other dragging a half-dead suitcase with a broken wheel. And he wasn't looking at the shops, or the people, or the whispers. He was looking for one thing. The sign came into view like a wound reopening Nia in wind. He paused. For a long time, his throat worked against the dryness like he was swallowing gravel. The dust caught in his lungs. He doubled over and coughed a thick, wet, body-racking cough that made an old woman across the road back away slowly. When he straightened, blood dotted the corner of his lips. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and then kept moving. By the time he reached the front of the shop, his knees buckled. And Ray Zola, the man and who once stood beside supermodels who graced Parisian stages and bathed in light, fell to his knees on the dirt outside Nia's doorway. He didn't call out her name, not yet. He simply knelt there, breathing hard, sweat mingling with dust, his body trembling like something barely stitched together. He didn't care that people were gathering, that phones were out, that the neighborhood children were whispering, "That's her old boyfriend. She gave him everything. He left and got famous." He came back looking like a ghost. Inside, Nia had paused mid-seam. She heard the noise before she saw him. It wasn't loud, just charged. An energy outside that didn't belong. Her scissors hovered above the fabric hand, suspended. Then a knock, soft. Not on the door, on the wall. Like someone too broken to stand had reached up and tapped with the side of a fist. She rose slowly, walked toward the door, pulled the curtain back, and there he was, Ray, on his knees, eyes locked on her, face hollow, lips trembling, hands outstretched, not like a man begging for money, but like someone begging for memory. "Nia," he croaked. She didn't blink, didn't move. He dropped his head lower. "Please." The crowd shifted, murmuring. Some snickered. Others just stared, waiting for the storm. "I was wrong," he said. "I lost myself. I thought I had time." Nia stepped forward, slowly, measured. Someone gasped. Phones went up. Ray looked up at her, his eyes red. "I was going to come back. I swear to you, Nia. But things got loud. And then fast. And then I couldn't hear you anymore. I couldn't hear me." She still hadn't said a word. Ray's voice cracked. "They dropped me. The label. They said I wasn't commercial enough." The girl left the second the check stopped. "I've been coughing blood for weeks. There's something wrong with my lungs. They say it's stress. They say it's life." The crowd shifted again, like breath being held collectively. "I have nothing," he said, not even pride. Still nothing from her. Then quietly, she turned, stepped back into the shop. Some thought she was going to slam the door. Others thought she was going to cry. A few whispered that maybe she'd take him back because women like her always did. But then she returned, holding something, the red umbrella, faded, torn, still bowed in the middle from that day at the station, but unmistakably whole. She walked down the steps, stood in front of him, and held it out. He reached for it, tears breaking from his eyes, chest heaving. But as he took it from her hands, she finally spoke, voice low, clear, like a blade. "You were soaked once, and I believed in you." The words hung in the air like incense. She met his eyes. No anger, just the devastating absence of warmth. "But I don't need an umbrella anymore." And then she turned, walked back inside. The curtain fell shut behind her. Ray was left kneeling, umbrella in hand. Crowd stunned. No one said a word. Eventually he stood barely and walked away, slow, limping. One child followed him for a few paces, watching the red umbrella swinging by his side. The whispers began again. But Nia, she sat at her machine, threaded the needle, and stitched. The streets had long forgotten Ray. After the scene in front of Nia's shop, the silent return. The red umbrella, the woman who didn't flinch, people lost interest in him almost overnight. He'd become a passing headline in neighborhood gossip, a cautionary tale people recited when they wanted to sound wise. See? That's what happens when you forget where you come from. He tried to stay in town, tried to find shelter. An old friend from the music days, a cousin he'd once paid rent for, a promoter he'd split drinks with during his rise. But no doors opened. Calls went unanswered. Eyes turned away in markets. The few who did speak to him did so with careful distance, like he was contagious not with disease, but with bad luck. He spent nights behind the shuttered bakery on a Kaikoi hill, huddled in a discarded shipping blanket. He kept the red umbrella near him like a makeshift tent, though it no longer kept rain out and barely shielded him from sun. Still, it was the only thing he had left that bore witness. In the background, the city churned forward. fast, indifferent. But somewhere deeper, something was stirring. A journalist from Accra Dede Mensa came across an old interview of Ray when he first arrived in Paris, nervous, raw eyes too bright for the camera. He talked about Ghana, about street music, about the girl who gave him everything when he had nothing. Dede, who had seen too many black artists disappear into Western machines and return broken, started asking questions. Then came the leak. An anonymous former assistant from the label shared scanned copies of Ray's contract online. It went viral within days. It was exploitative, almost grotesque. 50% of royalties gone to management. Ownership of all compositions, including Under the Red Umbrella, transferred to the label in perpetuity. Gag clauses, creative control surrendered. Fines for image violations, termination at will. It wasn't a contract. It was a coffin in legalese. The art world began to whisper, then to rage. Ghanaian artists from Accra to Tamale posted their own stories. A spoken word collective in Kumasi staged a protest reading outside a record label office. Even the Ministry of Culture released a lukewarm statement about reevaluating protection for local creatives. And Nia's name started surfacing again, not from her, never from her, but from those remembering the origin of Ray's rise. A clip resurfaced from a Paris interview where Ray, weeks before his collapse, was asked about his success. His smile in the clip was brittle, forced. "There was this woman," he said. "She gave me shelter. An umbrella. Literally. I thought I'd carry her with me. But I left her in the storm." The comment split public opinion like a blade. Some said Nia was heartless. He was sick. He begged. And she turned her back. Others defended her. She already paid his debts. She already died for him once. And in the middle of the digital shouting match, Ray collapsed. It happened outside a pharmacy. He was trying to exchange a bootlegged copy of his own album for cough syrup. The attendant called security. Before they arrived, Ray crumpled to the pavement, the umbrella falling from his grip. The hospital records marked it simply severe respiratory infection, malnutrition, early-stage tuberculosis. He was admitted under a generic name, Kwesi Doe, because he had no ID on him. The nurse only realized who he was when she saw the umbrella in the corner of the room. That's when the word reached Nia. She was in her shop as always, needle steady, radio off. Silence coiled around her like armor. As he older, braver, had come to her trembling. "Auntie Nia," she said. "They say Ray is in Ridge Hospital. He doesn't look good." Nia kept stitching. "They said it was his lungs." He passed out on the street. Still the stitch went on. "They think he might not make it." That's when Nia's fingers slipped. The needle pricked her thumb, a clean break of skin. Blood beaded bright and perfect. She stood without a word, walked to the back of the shop, and closed the door behind her. Inside she sat. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't touch the umbrella on the wall. She just sat. Because what do you do when the man who tore you apart is now being torn apart by the same hands he once fed? She remembered her mother's words. Kindness is good. But misplaced kindness, that's how the strongest hearts are broken. She had already bled for him. Already buried her mother in silence. Already become someone else. She didn't owe him anything. And yet, she closed her eyes. And in the darkness, behind her lids, she saw him again. Not as he was now coughing and skeletal, but as he had been sitting on her steps, eating roasted plantains, singing with his eyes half closed, humming a song that didn't exist yet. She opened her eyes, and the stitch in her heart throbbed. Nia didn't move, but something in her had already begun to shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something quieter. Recognition. Because when a storm destroys you, the only thing more dangerous than forgiving it is pretending it never happened. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and forgotten hope. Dim ceiling lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the linoleum floor, as Nia walked down the corridor with the quiet precision of someone who didn't want to be seen. She kept her scarf low over her forehead and wore a coat heavier than the weather called for. Not because it was cold, but because she needed the extra weight, the armor. The nurses didn't ask questions. She knew how to walk like she belonged. Room 207. She stood in front of the door for a long moment, hand hovering just inches from the knob. Inside, Ray lay tethered to machines he never imagined his life would depend on. Machines that beeped slowly, rhythmically, reminding him, with every tone, that he hadn't earned this silence. Nia didn't enter right away. She leaned against the wall, exhaling so softly, it was like she feared even her breath might give her away. She listened for movement, for a voice, for any sign that he was awake. But all she heard was the sound of a struggling body, still trying to remember how to live. She stepped inside quietly. Ray was asleep, or close to it. His face was turned toward the window where slats of morning sun filtered through bent blinds. The red umbrella was propped on the windowsill, cleaned, now gently folded. A nurse must have recognized it from the tabloid photos and placed it there out of reverence. Or pity. Nia didn't approach the bed. Instead, she walked to the small corkboard above his head, where someone had tacked hospital instructions and a prayer card. She removed both, and in their place, she pinned a single page, folded carefully, the ink slightly smudged. It was the full lyrics to Under the Red Umbrella, written by hand, her hand. Every line, every stanza. Even the refrain he'd never recorded, the one she once heard him hum under his breath on a night long ago when Mama was asleep and the power had gone out. He'd strummed a few chords in the dark, whispering into the quiet. She remembered that version, the real version. The version before producers got to it, before stylists and agents and managers peeled it apart and rebuilt it into something shinier but emptier. She wanted him to see it, to remember, to know that even after everything, after betrayal, after silence, after all the cold, careful years, she still remembered the music they made before the world noticed him. That was enough. She didn't need an apology, didn't need a spotlight, didn't even need him to know she'd come. She stepped back, took one last look at the man in the bed, his chest rising unevenly, face thinner than it had ever been. Then she left. No words, no footsteps loud enough to be traced, just the faint scent of lemongrass and fabric starch lingering in the air behind her. That night, Ray woke with a start. At first, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling was foreign. The sterile hum of machines, unfamiliar. Then, the pain came dull, heavy, blooming across his chest. He turned his head, slowly wincing. That's when he saw the lyrics, pinned carefully above his bed, held in place by a single red pushpin. At first, he didn't understand. Then his eyes scanned the lines, line after line. He read it once, then again. And when he reached the bottom, the final verse, the one he thought only he remembered, he broke. Tears spilled from his eyes. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, desperate grief. The kind that didn't scream, the kind that forgave. He pressed one hand to the words like a child pressing fingers to glass, trying to feel what's beyond. And for the first time since the stage lights faded, since the money disappeared, since his name stopped ringing in VIP rooms, he wept without shame. Not because he lost everything, but because she hadn't needed to remind the world. She only reminded him. Nia returned to her shop the next morning and opened earlier than usual. She wiped the windows clean, repainted the name on the sign Nia and Windy. Then she opened the doors wide. Children gathered again, like they used to, peering in, unsure if she would wave them off like before. But Nia stepped outside, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "If you're going to stare, you might as well learn." Their eyes widened. "You want to sew?" she asked. "You want to stitch and cut and turn scraps into something beautiful?" They nodded tentatively. "Then come inside. But if you waste thread, you sweep the floor." They smiled, followed her in. She lined them up, gave each one a scrap of cloth, a needle, and a rule. You can't be afraid of poking yourself. But if you bleed, you wipe it and you try again. By noon, the shop echoed with the sound of laughter. Not loud, not forced, just life breathing through the seams again. That evening, when she hung the red umbrella back on its hook, she looked at it differently. Not as a grave marker, not even as a memory, but as proof that some things could be broken, left out in the storm, and still shelter someone, still matter, still return, quietly, just like forgiveness. She showed up on a Tuesday morning, small and barefoot, with a book clutched tight to her chest and the kind of silence that made you notice. Her name was Amma, and she was the daughter of Akosua, the woman who swept the church floors and folded laundry for half the neighborhood. No one ever paid a kosua enough, but she kept showing up humming songs no one remembered the words to. Nia first noticed Amma because the girl kept hovering outside the shop, not begging, not talking, just watching. Always near the doorway, eyes fixed on the machine, as if the rhythm of the pedal and needle spoke a language she alone could hear. By the fourth day, Nia had had enough of the shadows. "You want something, child?" she asked, eyes still on her stitching. Amma stepped into the light. She couldn't have been more than 11. Her dress was 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled and pinned with safety pins. But her back was straight, and her voice, when it came, didn't tremble. "I want to learn." "Learn what?" "To sew." Nia looked up. The light from the window caught the red umbrella behind her, casting its faded outline across the shop floor like a ghost too patient to leave. "And why would you want that?" Amma hesitated, then pulled the book from her chest and held it out. Nia took it. Inside were pages of pencil sketches, clothing mostly. Some crude, some surprising, but all alive with possibility. A mix of gowns, bold sleeve designs, rough patterns modeled after the kente shapes only women in the northern villages still wore. "You draw these?" Amma nodded. Nia didn't smile, but something flickered in her. "Who taught you?" "No one. I copy clothes I see in markets, and I imagine the rest." Nia flipped another page. Paused. One sketch showed a girl holding an umbrella. Not just any umbrella, a red one. The lines were exaggerated, almost whimsical, like something from a fable. Above it, scrawled in large, messy handwriting, "The girl with the umbrella who stopped the rain." Nia's throat caught. "What's this?" she asked. Amma shifted. "It's a story I'm writing. About a girl who saves a village from a storm, but no one knows it was her. So the umbrella becomes a legend." "A legend?" Amma nodded, eyes bright now. "My mother said people still talk about you, how you gave your heart away and got nothing back. But I don't think that's true. I think you gave your heart away and got something bigger." Nia stared at her. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Amma said, shrugging. "You opened the door." That was all she said. That afternoon, Nia cleared a space near the window and set up an old stool and a battered sewing kit. She didn't announce anything, just pointed at the chair. Amma sat, quietly, gratefully. Over the next weeks, more girls came. Friends of Amma, then cousins, then daughters of women who once whispered behind Nia's back. Word spread not loudly, not like gossip, but like water through dry earth. She never called it a school. It was a space, a rhythm, a passing on. One day, while helping Amma cut a pattern, Nia paused. "You know," she said, not looking up, "I used to think this work was about perfection. Straight seams, even tension, clean hems." Amma looked at her curious. "But it's not," Nia continued. "It's about resilience, mending wet tears, holding things together long enough for people to grow into them." Amma smiled. "Like you." Nia chuckled, just barely. "No, like us." The village changed slowly, as all things do. Some nights near the well, old women would tell stories to children perched on stone ledges, lanterns flickering beside them. And always someone would ask about the girl with the red umbrella. Did she really carry a man from the rain into her house? Did she really forgive him after he left? Did she really walk away when he came back? The elders would smile, not giving answers. "It doesn't matter," they'd say. She carried him when no one else would. And she let him go when no one else dared. In markets, red umbrellas began to appear again. Not the expensive kind, simple ones. But they sold faster than ever. And some women began sewing little red patterns into the hems of their wrappers. Silent tributes. Quiet strength. Nia never spoke of Ray again, but his song lived in Amma's sketchbook. His silence lived in the way Nia taught the girls to let their stitches show. Not to hide the repairs, but to celebrate them. Amma once asked Nia if she regretted loving him. Nia didn't answer right away. She just pointed to the umbrella still hanging above the door. "That's not there to remind me of pain," she said. "It's there to remind me I survived it." Amma nodded and wrote that down, too. They buried Ray on a Wednesday morning just before the rains came. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of the city, where the cracked red earth bled into tall grass and time moved slower. There wasn't a ceremony, not really. Just a stretch of open ground, a pinewood casket, and the smell of something final in the air. The staff at the hospital tried to reach someone, anyone. Old contacts, former bandmates, the label that once branded his name on every billboard from Accra to Paris. No one responded. One woman sent back a voice note saying, "I haven't heard from Ray in over a year. I thought he'd gone back to Europe." No one came. No flowers, no cameras, no press. The world that once cheered him forward had moved on long ago. But when the grave diggers arrived, they found something unexpected already waiting. Propped gently against the wooden cross marking his grave sat a red umbrella. It wasn't new. The fabric had faded, worn from age, with one rib slightly bent like a bowed spine refusing to break. There was no note, no ribbon, no explanation. But it stood tall against the breeze. The men paused, exchanged glances, and said nothing. They left it there, not because they knew the story, but because some things don't need explanation. Later that afternoon, as the sky darkened, Nia stood on the far side of the cemetery beneath a crooked almond tree. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her posture still. There was no grief on her face, no sorrow painted for the world to read. Only stillness, only truth. She didn't bring flowers, didn't approach the grave. She simply stood close enough to see the umbrella, far enough to remain unseen. From where she stood, the grave looked quiet, at peace. A chapter closed. She exhaled, a long, slow breath, and then she bowed her head, not for Ray, not entirely, but for everything that had been carried, for everything that had been endured. For the part of herself she had once given away, and the stronger part that returned in its place. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her skirt. She turned, let it wrap around her shoulders, and walked away. Weeks passed. In the narrow back room of Nia and Wendy, the sewing machines hummed like lullabies. The girls had grown older, bolder, sharper with their hands and their questions. Amma was now teaching others her own sketches stitched into bright fabric. One afternoon, Nia arrived with 2 carts. Rusted, squeaky, pushed by 2 boys from the mechanic shop. Inside were 6 compact sewing machines, freshly tuned, old but strong. She lined them up in the center of the room, then turned to the group of women waiting by the door. Most of them were older. Mothers, aunties, some with tired eyes, others with the kind of stubborn hope only hunger could teach. "You want to learn?" she asked. They nodded. "Then sit." No applause, no speech. But one woman, after setting up her fabric, asked, "How much do we pay?" Nia looked at her. "You already paid," she said. "You've been paying your whole life. It's time something paid you back." And that was that. Each machine was etched with a single phrase embroidered into the seat cushion beneath the spool holder. Not large, not flashy, but there. "Tình yêu không phải để giữ, mà để dạy cách buông." It took the women a few tries to translate it from the Vietnamese script Amma had insisted on preserving. But when they understood, they nodded. They stitched. They cried, some of them, and then they began again. That night, Amma approached Nia with a notebook in hand. "I want to turn the story into a book," she said. Nia raised an eyebrow. "A book, a fable. But real, for girls like me." Nia said nothing. Amma flipped open the notebook. Inside was a page of rough illustrations, a girl standing in the rain, a red umbrella, overhead arms open not to protect herself, but to shelter others. She'd written a single dedication at the top, "To the woman who held the sky up long enough for me to learn how to walk." Nia stared at it for a long time. Then finally she whispered, "Let the wind take it." Amma looked confused. "What?" Nia smiled. Stories that matter always find their way. The doors of Nia and Wendy no longer creaked when opened. Someone had come by to fix the hinges. A woman with 2 children who once sold second-hand sandals at the edge of the market. She offered to do the repairs for free, said she owed Nia more than she could explain. Nia didn't ask questions. She only handed her a cup of hibiscus tea, then sat beside her while she worked. By now, the shop had changed. The walls were covered in fabric, some plain, some boldly colored, but all sewn by hands that had once trembled with uncertainty. There were no mirrors. That had been intentional. Nia once believed mirrors told the truth. But over time, she realized they only told the version of yourself you were ready to face. Instead, she put up windows, wide ones, letting light spill across the room like it belonged there. She was no longer the only teacher. Amma ran the younger class. A tall girl from Nungua led the design corner. Mothers taught daughters. Friends taught each other. It had become a place where silence could heal, where stitches were stronger than words, and thread knew how to carry pain into something wearable. They didn't just learn to sew, they learned to start over. Women who had lost homes, girls who had been told no too many times, wives, widows, runaways. They came with different stories, but found the same quiet belonging between the hum of a pedal and the tug of a needle. And Nia, she still came early, still opened the windows wide, still brewed the tea herself, but she didn't always sit by the machine anymore. These days, she spent more time in the back garden, tending to rows of tomatoes, chili peppers, and collard greens. Seeds from her mother's old tin boxes, the ones she once nearly threw away but never could. The garden had grown lush under her care, messy in places, wild in others, but alive, honest. Much like the women who passed through her workshop. Sometimes when the wind was high, the red umbrella by the door would rattle in its hook. Amma had offered to retire it once, frame it like an artifact. Nia only smiled. "It still works," she'd said, and that was the end of that. On one particular afternoon, as the sun softened into gold and the sound of sewing machines dimmed behind her, Nia sat on the porch, a cup of ginger tea cradled between her palms. The garden stretched out before her, a mussel with the scent of soil and new things. Bees hovered lazily between leaves. A child's laughter rang out from inside the shop, followed by the firm but amused voice of Amma telling someone to unpick their seam and start again. Nia smiled. She was older now, but not tired. She watched a single tomato ripen on the vine and thought of her mother, how she used to say, "Grow it yourself if you want to taste truth." The red umbrella shifted in the wind, tapping gently against the wooden beam. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Behind her, Nia and wind pulsed with life. But here in this moment, there was only quiet, only breath, only the kind of peace you don't announce, but earn. A gentle voice rose from inside the shop. A melody. Familiar. Amma singing low and soft. "Under the red umbrella, you held me when I broke. And though you never said forever, you taught me how to hope." The words drifted through the air, unforced. The camera began to pull back slowly, catching Nia from behind her silhouette framed by the doorway garden in front of her. The red umbrella catching wind once more, straining forward like a kite that had not forgotten the sky. The farther the camera moved, the smaller she became, and yet somehow more whole. A final breeze swept through. Leaves rustled. The umbrella shifted once, then stilled, and over the screen, a final line appeared, stitched not in thread, but in memory. An umbrella is not just a shelter from the rain, but a temporary roof for those who have lost their way. Happiness does not come from holding on, but from learning to let go. One last note of the song, carried by the wind, as if it had always been there waiting to be heard.